The sirens weren't getting closer, they were getting louder because more were joining the chorus. Martha's knees buckled, and she grabbed the edge of the safe to steady herself, her arthritic fingers scraping against the cold steel. The photograph fluttered to the cabin floor, her younger face staring up from the dusty planks like an accusation. "Martha!" Frank's voice cut through the wailing wind outside, sharp with an edge she hadn't heard in 40 years of marriage. "Martha, look at me." But she couldn't tear her eyes away from the neat stacks of bills filling the safe. Hundreds. All of them. More money than they'd ever dreamed of, more than enough to solve every problem that had brought them to this moment. The eviction notice, the medical bills from Frank's heart surgery, the slow grinding poverty that had eaten away at their dignity, one unpaid utility bill at a time. "I don't understand," she whispered, though even as the words left her lips, fragments were surfacing. Not memories exactly, but impressions, the weight of responsibility, the taste of fear, a man's voice saying her name with the kind of familiarity reserved for co-conspirators. Frank moved around the safe, his work boots crunching on something that might have been broken glass or ice tracked in from outside. When he crouched to pick up the photograph, she saw how his hands shook, not from the cold, but from the kind of shock that rewrites everything you thought you knew about your life. "This is you," he said, holding up the picture. "Jesus Christ, Martha, this is definitely you, but look at the date stamp. December 23rd, 1987, the day of the robbery, the day her career died and their first marriage crumbled under the weight of suspicion and shame. She'd been investigated for months, cleared of criminal wrongdoing but forever marked as the bank manager whose carelessness had made the heist possible. Frank had stood by her through the FBI interviews, the internal investigations, the whispered accusations from neighbors who'd read too many newspaper articles. They'd even remarried 5 years later, after the scandal died down, because they'd convinced themselves their love could survive anything. Now she wondered if their entire second chance had been built on a lie. The note lay crumpled beside the photograph where Frank had dropped it. Martha smoothed it out with trembling fingers, reading the words again, "Thank you for keeping your promise." What promise? She'd never made any promises to bank robbers. Had she? "We need to leave," Frank said, struggling to his feet. At 73, his knees were worse than hers, bone grinding against bone after decades of crawling under car hoods. "Right now, before whoever's coming gets here." "They're not coming for the cabin," Martha said, the certainty hitting her like a physical blow. "They're coming for us. They've been tracking us." "That's impossible. Nobody even knows we're here. Hell, we didn't know we were coming here until an hour ago when we saw the lights." But Martha was already shaking her head, pieces of a puzzle she didn't remember solving clicking into place. The eviction notice had come exactly 3 days before Christmas, the same timeline as 1987. Their landlord had been apologetic but firm. He'd found a cash buyer for the building, someone willing to pay above market value for a quick close. No extensions, no exceptions. "Frank, what if the eviction wasn't random? What if someone wanted us homeless right now, tonight, in this storm?" His face went grey in the generator's harsh light. "You're scaring me." The sirens were definitely getting closer now, their wail echoing off the canyon walls in a way that made it impossible to tell which direction they were coming from. Martha looked around the cabin with fresh eyes, noting details she'd missed in the shock of discovery. The generator was nearly new, its fuel tank full. The cabin itself was old but recently maintained, no leaks in the roof, fresh caulking around the windows. Someone had been caring for this place, keeping it ready for them. "We can't take all of it," she said, her banker's mind automatically calculating weight and volume. "But we can take enough." "Take it?" Frank stared at her, as if she'd suggested they rob a church. "Martha, this is evidence. This is stolen money. If what you're thinking is true, if you were somehow involved, then touching this makes us accomplices." She met his eyes, seeing the man she'd fallen in love with twice, the man who'd rebuilt transmissions with the same patient precision he'd used to rebuild their life together. "What if I already was an accomplice? What if the only choice now is between being poor accomplices and rich ones?" Outside, the storm howled with renewed fury, as if the mountains themselves were trying to bury the truth deeper. But Martha could feel it surfacing anyway, 36 years of suppressed memory clawing its way back to consciousness. The sirens were almost here. The sirens cut through the night like broken glass. And suddenly, Martha was 68 years old again, standing in their cramped Denver apartment 3 days ago, holding the eviction notice with hands that had once counted millions in government bonds. The paper had been official, stamped, final, just like everything else in their carefully constructed ordinary life. 30 days, she'd read aloud to Frank, who was nursing his morning coffee and the arthritis that made holding a wrench torture these days. They're giving us 30 days. 30 days until what? He'd squinted at her over his reading glasses, the same ones he'd worn to read repair manuals for 15 years. Salt and pepper stubble covered his jaw because shaving had become another small battle against time and trembling hands. Until we're homeless. The word had hung between them like a death sentence. Homeless. At their age. After 40 years of marriage. Well, 35, if you didn't count the 5-year gap when the bank robbery investigation had torn them apart like a grenade in their living room. Frank had set down his coffee mug with the careful precision he used for everything now, as if sudden movements might shatter what little stability they had left. The mug read "World's Best Grandpa," though they'd never had children. It was a garage sale find from their leaner years, back when Frank still took weekend jobs fixing neighbors' cars in the apartment complex parking lot. "There has to be something we can do," he'd said, the same words he'd used when his company downsized him at 68, the same words when Martha's small pension couldn't cover his heart medication, the same words they'd repeated like a prayer as their savings account dwindled to double digits. But Martha had read enough eviction notices during her banking years to recognize the language of inevitability. The building had been sold to developers who planned to tear it down for luxury condos. Market forces, progress, the same euphemisms banks used when they foreclosed on families who'd missed 3 payments because someone got cancer. Their ordinary world had been shrinking for years, measured in small defeats and careful compromises. Dinner became lunch leftovers. Cable television became library books. Frank's workshop in the basement storage unit became a memory when they couldn't afford the monthly fee. Martha's weekly coffee with her neighbor Eleanor became every other week, then monthly, then a polite nod in the hallway because admitting you couldn't afford $4 for a latte felt like advertising your failure. The apartment itself was a testament to decades of making do. Furniture that had been purchased new in 1995 and maintained through sheer stubbornness. A refrigerator that Frank had repaired so many times it sounded like a diesel engine. Photographs covering nail holes in walls they weren't allowed to paint, capturing happier times when they thought their love could survive anything, including FBI investigations and newspaper headlines that made Martha's name synonymous with either incompetence or complicity. She'd built their second life around routine because routine felt safe. Monday grocery shopping with carefully clipped coupons. Tuesday visits to the senior center for free blood pressure checks. Wednesday afternoons when Frank volunteered at the community college, teaching young mechanics tricks he'd learned before computers took over car engines. Thursdays were Martha's favorite, helping immigrants at the library with their citizenship paperwork, using her head for numbers to make sense of government forms that seemed designed to confuse and exclude. Fridays they walked. Always the same route through Cheeseman Park, past the young families and joggers who represented the Denver they could no longer afford. Frank would point out birds he'd learned to identify from library books. Martha would calculate how much the houses were worth now, comparing them to what she remembered from her banking days when she'd approved mortgages for teachers and firefighters who'd since been priced out by tech workers and transplants. Weekends were for maintenance. Frank still insisted on changing their car's oil himself, though it took him 3 times as long and left him exhausted for days. Martha balanced their checkbook with the same meticulous care she'd once used for federal deposits, though now the numbers fit on a single page and never added up to enough. Their Social Security checks arrived with clockwork precision. disappearing just as quickly into rent, utilities, and medications that kept Frank's damaged heart beating steadily. They'd learned to live in the spaces between major expenses, stretching dollars like taffy, making every purchase a carefully weighed decision. But the eviction notice had shattered even those modest expectations. 3 days before Christmas, 3 days to find somewhere else to live on a budget that couldn't cover first month, last month, and security deposit for anything decent. Martha had called 17 apartments that first day, listening to landlords explain why senior citizens on fixed incomes weren't their preferred tenants. Now, standing in this cabin, with $255 million in stolen money and sirens closing in, she realized their ordinary world hadn't been ordinary at all. It had been a carefully constructed holding pattern, keeping them in place until this moment arrived. The sirens were almost here, and Martha understood that their quiet desperation had been someone else's design all along. The first explosion of red and blue light through the cabin windows hit Martha like a physical blow, not metaphorically, actually, literally, her body recoiling as if the photons themselves carried the weight of 36 years of buried truth. Frank's weathered hand shot out to grab her arm, his mechanic's grip still strong enough to leave marks. "They found us," he whispered, but Martha was already shaking her head because the timing was too perfect, too orchestrated. You don't find people this fast in a blizzard unless you knew exactly where they were going. The photograph in her trembling fingers showed a woman who looked like her but carried herself differently. Shoulders back, chin raised, eyes bright, with the kind of confidence Martha couldn't remember ever possessing. December 23, 1987, the worst day of her life, according to 40 years of carefully maintained narrative. But looking at this woman's face, she saw no fear, no confusion, just determination. "Frank, what if we were supposed to find this?" "Supposed to?" His voice cracked like breaking ice. "Martha, you're talking like someone planned for us to get evicted in a blizzard and stumble across a fortune in stolen money. That's conspiracy theory nonsense." But even as he said it, she could see him calculating the impossibilities, the cabin's generator running despite years of apparent abandonment, the safe combination that had responded to her old bank protocols like muscle memory, the note thanking her for a promise she couldn't remember making, but somehow, in the deepest part of her mind, felt real. The sirens were splitting now, some continuing up the mountain road, others stopping closer than she wanted to think about. Through the frosted windows, she caught glimpses of searchlights sweeping the tree line with mechanical precision. Not the random pattern of a search and rescue operation, the methodical grid of people who knew their target's location. "We have maybe 5 minutes, Martha said, her banker's mind automatically shifting into crisis mode. "Pack light, bills only, nothing traceable." "You want to steal it." Frank's words hung in the air like an indictment. "After everything we went through in '87, all the investigations, the suspicion, losing our friends, our reputation, you want to steal money and run." Martha looked at him across the open safe. This man who'd held her through panic attacks and FBI interrogations, who'd remarried her when the scandal died down because he believed in their love more than other people's whispers. His face showed the same expression from their divorce papers signing in 1989. Not anger, but exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of a man watching someone he loved make choices he couldn't follow. "What if I already stole it, Frank? What if that's why they're here?" The searchlights were getting closer, their beams cutting through the storm with mechanical persistence. In their harsh illumination, the money looked different, not like found treasure, but like evidence, like bait. Martha's hands moved without conscious thought, stuffing bills into her worn purse with the same efficiency she'd once used to process deposits. Hundreds became thousands, became enough to start over somewhere warm. Frank watched her with the expression of a man realizing his wife was a stranger. "The eviction notice," she said, her mind racing ahead of her words. 3 days before Christmas, same as the robbery. Our landlord said he had a cash buyer, someone willing to pay above market for a quick close. So what if someone bought our building just to make us homeless? What if someone wanted us desperate enough to run into a storm, desperate enough to break into an abandoned cabin, desperate enough to— She gestured at the safe, the money, the photograph of a woman who looked like her but felt like someone else entirely. Frank's face went pale. To steal money that was already stolen. Outside, she could hear boots crunching through snow, multiple sets moving with tactical precision rather than search and rescue urgency. Radio chatter filtered through the wind, codes and coordinates that meant nothing to her but everything to whoever was closing in. "We can leave the money," Frank said quietly. "Walk out with our hands up, explain that we just needed shelter from the storm. Tell them we never opened the safe." Martha looked at the bills in her purse, then at the photograph showing a version of herself she didn't recognize but somehow missed. The woman in the picture had made choices, bold ones, dangerous ones. She'd kept promises and built plans and done something significant enough that someone had hidden $255 million for her to find 36 years later. The woman Martha had become lived on Social Security and clipped coupons and apologized for existing in a world that had already decided she was irrelevant. But that woman had also spent 40 years being exactly what everyone expected: predictable, harmless, forgettable. "Or," she said, meeting Frank's eyes, "we take enough to disappear and spend whatever time we have left figuring out who I really am." The searchlights found the cabin windows, flooding the interior with white light that turned everything sharp and unavoidable. Time was up. Choice was here. The white light turned Frank's face into a collection of deep shadows and harsh angles, making him look older than his 73 years. Martha could see every line carved by decades of honest work, every worry Mark earned through their struggles with poverty and scandal. This was the face that had looked at her across a courtroom in 1989 when they'd signed divorce papers, not because he stopped loving her, but because he couldn't bear watching her destroy herself with guilt over something she swore she hadn't done. "Martha." His voice carried the same careful tone he'd used during those FBI interviews when every word mattered and the wrong answer could mean prison. "If we take this money, there's no going back. We become the people they always said we were." She clutched the photograph tighter, studying the woman who wore her face, but none of her fear. That Martha stood in what looked like a bank vault, surrounded by stacks of currency, her expression calm and purposeful. No guilt, no confusion, just someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why. "What if we already are those people?" she whispered. "What if everything we remember about 1987 is wrong?" The boots outside were definitely military or law enforcement. Too coordinated for civilians, too purposeful for search and rescue. Through the window she caught glimpses of tactical gear, weapons, the kind of hardware that suggested this wasn't about rescuing lost seniors from a blizzard. Frank moved to the window, careful to stay in the shadows. "There's got to be a dozen of them. Full gear. This isn't some local sheriff's department." Martha's banker mind was cataloguing impossibilities. Federal agents didn't mobilize this quickly for missing persons. They didn't deploy tactical teams for welfare checks, which meant someone had been watching them, tracking them, waiting for exactly this moment. "The heart medication," she said suddenly, the realization hitting her like ice water. "Your prescription. You said the pharmacy had to special order it last month." "Yeah. They said my usual supplier was out of stock." Frank turned from the window, his face pale. "Why does that matter?" "Because that prescription has GPS tracking for high-risk seniors, insurance requirement for expensive medications." Her fingers were shaking as she pulled bills from the safe, muscle memory guiding her hands while her mind raced through implications. "They know exactly where we are. They've known for hours." The radio chatter outside was getting clearer as the teams got closer. Alpha Team, perimeter secured, package located, the kind of military precision that suggested this operation had been planned long before they'd stumbled through that cabin door. Frank sat down heavily on the cot, his face grey with exhaustion or shock or both. 40 years, Martha. 40 years I've been married to you, and I don't know if I ever really knew who you were." The words cut deeper than the FBI accusations ever had, because those came from strangers who saw her as a suspect. This came from the man who'd held her through nightmares, who'd learned to cook when her depression made leaving bed impossible, who'd agreed to remarry her because he believed their love could survive anything. "I don't know either," she admitted, stuffing more bills into her purse. The money felt real enough. Crisp, clean Federal Reserve notes that her trained eye recognized as genuine. But everything else felt like fragments of someone else's life. But that woman in the photograph? She looks like someone who kept her promises. A voice outside, amplified by a megaphone, cut through the storm. "Federal agents. The cabin is surrounded. Exit with your hands visible." Martha met Frank's eyes across the small space that had become their entire world. 40 years of marriage, 2 years of divorce, and 36 years of carefully rebuilt ordinary life had led to this moment. She could see him calculating the same impossible arithmetic she was, the odds of innocent explanation versus the weight of $255 million in evidence. "If we surrender," she said quietly, "they'll want to know how we opened the safe. They'll want to know about the photograph, the note, why someone left this for us to find. And if we run, then we become fugitives, at our age, in this storm." She looked at the money in her hands, enough to buy freedom or condemn them forever. "Frank, what if running is what I was always supposed to do? What if 40 years ago I made a deal and the price was forgetting who I really was until the time came to remember?" The megaphone crackled again, "Mrs. Kellerman. We know you're in there. We just want to talk." They knew her name. Not Frank's, hers specifically. Which meant this wasn't about two homeless seniors seeking shelter. This was about Martha Kellerman, former bank manager, and whatever she'd done, or promised, or agreed to, 36 years ago when her whole world collapsed. Frank stood up slowly, his decision written in the set of his shoulders. "Then I guess we find out together." But Martha could hear the doubt in his voice, see the fear in his eyes. After 40 years, he was finally wondering if the woman he'd loved had been real at all. Martha watched Frank move toward the cabin door, and something inside her crystallized into diamond-hard certainty. Not about who she was, that remained a terrifying mystery, but about what she refused to lose. Whatever truth waited outside in the glare of tactical flashlights, she wouldn't face it empty-handed and helpless. "No." The word came out sharper than she'd intended, carrying an authority she didn't remember possessing. Frank stopped, his hand halfway to the door latch. "We don't surrender. Not after surviving 40 years of their suspicion. Not after building a life from nothing twice." She moved to the safe with sudden purpose, her hands working automatically to transfer stacks of bills into the canvas grocery bag they'd carried their meager possessions in. The money felt like validation, like someone had finally paid her for decades of careful silence about things she couldn't quite remember, but had never forgotten. "Martha, this is insane." Frank's voice cracked with desperation. "We're 70 years old. Where exactly do you think we're going to run?" "I don't know yet." She folded the photograph carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket, next to the note that thanked her for keeping promises she'd apparently made in another lifetime. "But that woman," she gestured to where the photograph had been, "she didn't spend her life apologizing for existing. She made plans, big ones." The megaphone crackled again. "Closer now, Mrs. Kellerman. We have the cabin surrounded. There's nowhere to go in this storm. Let's resolve this peacefully." Martha grabbed Frank's winter coat from the hook by the door and thrust it at him. "The storm is exactly why this might work. They can't use helicopters or thermal imaging effectively. Their equipment advantage disappears in whiteout conditions." Frank stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "Since when do you know about thermal imaging?" "Since never," her conscious mind replied. But something deeper, some buried instinct, was feeding her tactical knowledge she had no business possessing. Martha pushed the disorienting feeling aside and focused on immediate survival. The safe's interior light revealed a small trap door at the back, probably access to utility lines. "Help me move this." She was already pulling at the metal panel, her banker's fingers finding the hidden release mechanism without conscious thought. The space behind was barely large enough for a person, but it led into darkness that might mean freedom. Frank remained frozen by the door. "You're talking about crawling through some kind of tunnel in a blizzard while federal agents hunt us. Do you hear yourself?" Martha looked at him, really looked, and saw not just fear but heartbreak. This man had spent 40 years rebuilding trust that the FBI had shattered in 1987. He'd defended her innocence to neighbors, friends, anyone who'd listen. Now she was asking him to become everything they'd once been accused of being. "I hear myself remembering," she said quietly, slinging the bag of money over her shoulder. "Frank, what if the woman you fell in love with in 1985 was the real me? What if the scared, apologetic person I became after the investigation was the performance?" Outside, she could hear tactical teams coordinating positions, their radio chatter professional and patient. They weren't rushing because they believed their targets were contained. Elderly fugitives in a blizzard presented minimal flight risk, especially with nowhere to run except deeper into wilderness that could kill them faster than bullets. They were wrong about the wilderness part. Martha couldn't explain how she knew, but she understood these mountains in a way that felt inherited rather than learned. The tunnel behind the safe led to an old mining shaft that connected to a network of forgotten passages, knowledge she shouldn't possess but trusted completely. "The investigation destroyed us once," she said, testing the tunnel opening with her flashlight. "But what if that was the point? What if someone needed Martha Kellerman to disappear so completely that even she forgot who she really was?" Frank's face cycled through emotions she'd never seen before: betrayal, terror, and something that might have been recognition. "You're talking about witness protection, about federal programs that erase people." "I'm talking about the only explanation that makes sense." Martha swung her legs into the tunnel, the cold metal biting through her jeans. "Someone robbed the Denver Federal Reserve using my access codes. Someone who knew exactly how I'd react, exactly how the investigation would go, exactly how it would end." The tunnel stretched ahead into blackness, but her flashlight revealed recent maintenance, fresh bolts, updated wiring. Someone had been keeping this escape route operational for decades. She turned back to face him, seeing their entire marriage suddenly illuminated by this moment of choice. "I can't force you to follow me into this, but I can't spend whatever time we have left wondering who I was supposed to be." Outside, boots crunched closer through the snow. Frank looked at the door, then at the tunnel, then at the woman he'd loved through poverty and scandal and 40 years of careful, ordinary days that had apparently been extraordinary after all. He grabbed the remaining money from the safe and kissed her forehead. "Then let's go find out." Frank dropped into the tunnel behind her with a grunt that echoed off metal walls. The space was tighter than it had looked from above, forcing them to crawl single file through darkness that pressed against their flashlight beams like something alive. Martha's knees protested against the cold steel, but her hands moved confidently along the walls, finding support beams and junction points as if she'd navigated this route before. "How do you know where you're going?" Frank's whisper carried an edge of panic as they reached a fork in the passage. Martha paused, genuinely unsure. Her logical mind had no answer, but her body was already turning left toward what felt like safety. "I don't know. I just do." The tunnel system was more extensive than any hunting cabin warranted. Emergency lighting flickered to life as they passed motion sensors, revealing maintenance schedules dated within the last 6 months. Someone had been preparing this escape route, keeping it operational, waiting for the day Martha Kellerman would need it again. Behind them, muffled voices indicated the agents had found the entrance. Radio chatter bounced off the tunnel walls, coordinates, team positions, orders to pursue with caution. They were being followed, but carefully, by people who seemed to understand these passages better than Frank did. "Martha," his voice was tight with exertion and fear. "These people, whoever they are, they're not surprised we ran. They're not even angry. They're just following protocol." She'd noticed it too. The tactical teams had surrounded the cabin with professional efficiency, but when she and Frank had disappeared into the tunnel, the response had been methodical rather than urgent, like they were being herded rather than hunted. The passage opened into a wider chamber carved from natural rock. Mining equipment from decades past sat covered in dust, but newer additions caught Martha's attention. A small generator, bottled water, emergency food supplies, a way station stocked for fugitives who knew to find it. Frank collapsed against the rock wall, his breathing labored from the crawl. At 73, with a heart condition and arthritis in both knees, he wasn't built for this kind of escape. Martha felt guilt pierce through her strange new certainty. Whatever promises her forgotten self had made, they were destroying the life she'd actually lived. "We can still go back," she said, though the words felt wrong in her mouth. "Tell them we panicked, that we were confused and scared." "With a bag full of stolen money?" Frank gestured at the canvas sack she'd been dragging through the tunnel. "Martha, we passed the point of innocent explanation the moment we opened that safe." A new voice echoed from the tunnel behind them. Not the tactical teams, but someone else. Older, familiar in a way that made Martha's chest tighten with half-remembered recognition. "Mrs. Kellerman, my name is Agent Sarah Chen. I think it's time we had a proper conversation." The woman who emerged from the passage moved with the careful authority of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, but her face showed genuine concern rather than threat. Middle-aged, Asian American wearing civilian clothes under a tactical vest that looked hastily added. Frank instinctively moved between Martha and the newcomer, but Agent Chen raised her hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to arrest you," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I'm here because 36 years ago you saved my life, and I've been waiting for the chance to return the favor." Martha stared at this woman she should have recognized but didn't, feeling the edges of memory stirring like ice breaking up in spring. "I don't remember you." "You wouldn't. The memory suppression was thorough, necessary for your protection and mine." Agent Chen moved slowly to the emergency supplies, retrieving a thermos of coffee that steamed when she opened it. "Fresh, recently prepared. But the deal we made is still in effect, even if only I remember the terms." Frank looked between the two women with growing desperation. "What deal? What are you talking about?" Agent Chen poured coffee into 3 cups with the practiced calm of someone conducting a business meeting rather than a fugitive negotiation. Martha Kellerman didn't accidentally leave vault codes exposed in 1987. She left them exactly where I told her to, exactly when our operation required. The Denver Federal Reserve robbery was never about the money. It was about extracting a federal witness whose cover had been blown. Martha accepted the coffee with hands that shook from more than cold. "What witness?" Agent Chen met her eyes with compassion and regret. "You were never a bank manager, Martha. You were FBI, deep undercover for 3 years, investigating a money laundering operation that reached into federal law enforcement. When they discovered your real identity, we had 48 hours to create a new one." The coffee was exactly how Martha liked it. Cream, no sugar, strong enough to wake the dead. Details Agent Chen shouldn't have known, unless the connection between them ran deeper than this moment. Frank set down his cup untouched. "You're saying our entire marriage is based on a lie?" "No," Agent Chen said gently. "The marriage is real. The love is real. Only the origin story needed to change." Martha felt the coffee burn her tongue, but the pain seemed distant, unimportant compared to the earthquake reshaping everything she thought she knew about herself. FBI, deep undercover. The words should have felt foreign, impossible, but instead they settled into place like missing puzzle pieces she'd been unconsciously searching for her entire adult life. "Show me," she said, setting the cup down with hands steadier than they had any right to be. "If you're telling the truth, prove it." Agent Chen reached into her vest and withdrew a slim folder, its edges worn from decades of careful handling. "Your real name was Martha Chen, my older sister. You chose Kellerman as your new identity because it was the maiden name of the bank manager whose life you'd been studying for 3 years. Martha opened the folder with a strange sensation of watching someone else's hands move. The first photograph showed two Asian American women in their 30s, standing outside what looked like a federal building. One face was familiar from mirrors and old photographs, herself but different, confident, dangerous. The other was clearly a younger version of Agent Chen. Frank leaned over her shoulder, his breathing shallow. "That's not... You don't look like that woman." "Plastic surgery," Agent Chen explained quietly. "Minor changes, but enough to pass casual inspection. The real transformation was psychological. Memory suppression, personality adjustment, carefully constructed trauma responses that would explain any behavioral inconsistencies." Martha flipped through more photographs. Herself in FBI gear, herself with weapons she somehow knew how to use, herself standing beside crime scenes that triggered flashes of almost memory. The final photo showed her and Frank at their first wedding in 1985, but now she could see what had been invisible before. The careful positioning that kept federal agents in the background, the expensive photographer who'd been documenting more than a ceremony, the way her own smile looked like someone acting happy rather than feeling it. "The money laundering investigation," she said, the words emerging from some buried part of her consciousness. "It involved federal judges, U.S. attorneys, people who could destroy witness protection from the inside. 17 convictions, Agent Chen confirmed, based on evidence you'd gathered over 3 years. But by the time we were ready to move, they'd identified you. We had to choose between extracting you safely or losing everything, including your life." Frank stood abruptly, pacing to the far side of the chamber with manic energy. "So the robbery was fake? The investigation that destroyed Martha's career, our marriage, everything we went through, it was all theater." "The money was real," Agent Chen said. "Federal Reserve notes that had been marked for destruction but diverted for operational use. Your pension, essentially, for services that could never be officially acknowledged." Martha looked at the canvas bag full of bills with new understanding. "You've been maintaining this place for 36 years, waiting for me to remember, to come back." "Waiting for the day your cover would be blown again," Agent Chen corrected. "We always knew this was temporary. The people you helped convict had long memories and longer reach. 3 of them died in federal prison, but the others have been getting out. Parole, sentence reductions, appeals. The last one was released 2 months ago." Frank stopped pacing, his face pale with realization. The eviction, the timing, 3 days before Christmas, during the worst blizzard in decades. That wasn't coincidence. "They wanted you desperate," Agent Chen confirmed. "Vulnerable, easy to locate and eliminate." What they didn't expect was for Martha's training to reassert itself when survival was at stake. Martha felt pieces of her fractured identity clicking together, but instead of relief, she experienced something closer to terror. The woman in these photographs was competent, professional, deadly when necessary. She was also a stranger who'd stolen 40 years of Martha Kellerman's ordinary life. "Frank doesn't deserve this," she said quietly. "He married someone who doesn't exist. He spent 40 years loving a performance." Agent Chen's expression softened. "He married the person you became when you felt safe enough to be vulnerable. The investigation, the disgrace, the poverty, it stripped away everything artificial and left only what was real. Your capacity for love, loyalty, resilience. That's not a performance, Martha. That's who you really are." Frank returned to sit beside her, his decision written in the set of his shoulders before he spoke. "I don't care who you were before I met you. I care about who you've been every day since." But Martha could see the fear in his eyes, the way he held himself slightly apart from her now. 40 years of marriage, and she'd become a stranger in the space of an hour. "The team's outside," she said, focusing on immediate survival because the emotional implications were too vast to process. "They're not here to arrest us." "No," Agent Chen confirmed. "They're here to extract you. New identities, new location, full federal protection." "But Martha," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "The suppression protocol can't be repeated. If you accept extraction, you'll remember everything. All of it. including the parts we made you forget for your own protection." Martha looked at Frank, at Agent Chen, at the photographs of a life she'd lived but couldn't remember. The safe had held money, but this tunnel held something far more dangerous, the truth about who she really was. And once she knew that, there would be no going back to the woman Frank had loved. The dark moment. Martha stared at the photographs scattered across the cold stone floor, each one revealing another fracture in the life she thought she'd lived. The woman looking back at her from those images wore confidence like armor, carried weapons with casual familiarity, and smiled with the calculated precision of someone who'd learned to weaponize trust itself. "I need to know what you made me forget," she said, her voice barely audible in the cavern's stillness. Agent Chen's face went ashen. "Martha, some memories were suppressed for good reason. The parts of the operation that went wrong, the people we couldn't save, the choices you had to make. Tell me." Frank reached for her hand, but Martha pulled away without thinking, the gesture automatic and cold. She watched hurt flicker across his face and realized with growing horror that this was what remembering meant, becoming someone who could hurt the people she loved without hesitation. Agent Chen opened a second folder with trembling fingers. The money laundering operation was bigger than we initially understood. It wasn't just federal judges and attorneys. It reached into witness protection itself. 3 families under federal protection were murdered in the 18 months before we extracted you, killed by people who should never have been able to find them. Martha felt ice forming in her chest as fragments of memory began surfacing unbidden. A house in Phoenix, a woman with 2 young children, blood on kitchen tile that no amount of scrubbing could remove. "You were supposed to maintain cover until we could identify the leak," Agent Chen continued, her voice professional but strained. "But the Hendersons, the family in Phoenix, they were going to be next. You broke protocol to warn them." The memory hit Martha like a physical blow. She remembered now, driving through the night to Phoenix, finding the safe house already under surveillance, making the choice that would expose her own operation to save strangers she'd never met before that moment. "It didn't work," Martha whispered, the truth emerging from the suppressed corners of her mind. "I was too late." Frank's sharp intake of breath told her he understood what she meant before Agent Chen confirmed it. Sarah Henderson was 28. Her children were 6 and 4. By the time you reached them, they'd been dead for 3 hours. Martha remembered standing in that blood-soaked kitchen, holding Sarah Henderson's lifeless daughter while tactical teams secured the scene around her. She remembered the weight of failure, the knowledge that her cover was blown and 3 more lives had been lost for nothing. "That's why you agreed to the memory suppression," Agent Chen said gently. "Not just for your protection, but because you couldn't live with what you'd seen, what you'd failed to prevent." Frank stood abruptly, backing away from both women. "You let her forget dead children? You made her forget people died because of this operation?" "We made her forget that she blamed herself for deaths that weren't her fault," Agent Chen shot back. Martha was spiraling into psychological collapse. The suppression protocol wasn't punishment, it was salvation. But Martha was remembering more now. The floodgates opened by the first terrible truth. Other families, other failures. A trail of bodies stretching across 3 years of deep cover work, all people who'd trusted the federal government to protect them and died for that faith. "How many?" she asked, though part of her already knew. 11 families, 37 people total, including children. Agent Chen's voice carried decades of guilt. "Not all of them were connected to your operation, but you blamed yourself for every single death." Frank looked at Martha as if seeing a stranger, which she supposed he was. "You've been living with me for 40 years, carrying this, and you never said anything?" "Because I didn't remember," Martha said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't entirely true. The nightmares she'd blamed on work stress, her irrational fear of young children, which she'd attributed to never having her own, the way she sometimes woke up checking locks and windows for no reason she could name. She'd been remembering all along. Her subconscious had been carrying the weight of 37 deaths for 4 decades, bleeding through the suppression protocol in dreams and anxieties she'd learned to dismiss as ordinary neuroses. "The people who want us dead," she said, understanding crystallizing with sickening clarity. "They're not just after revenge. They're after the evidence, the records I gathered during the operation." Agent Chen nodded reluctantly. "Hidden in a safety deposit box you established under a false identity. The location was suppressed along with everything else, but if you remember the operation, I remember where I put the evidence that could still destroy them." Martha looked at Frank, seeing her own horror reflected in his eyes. "They can't let me live long enough to remember." Outside the cavern, she could hear the tactical teams moving with new urgency. Radio chatter had increased, voices more clipped and professional. Something had changed in the last few minutes. Agent Chen was checking her phone, her face grim. "We have a problem. The extraction teams aren't ours anymore." Frank grabbed Martha's arm with desperate strength. "What does that mean?" "It means the leak in witness protection was never fixed," Martha said, the tactical part of her mind already calculating escape routes and survival odds. "It means we're trapped underground with people who've been hunting me for 36 years. And it means," she thought but didn't say aloud, "that remembering who I really am might be the last thing I ever do." The radio chatter outside suddenly went silent. Martha felt her body respond before her conscious mind processed the threat, muscles tensing, breathing shifting to the shallow, controlled rhythm she somehow knew would minimize sound. 40 years of suppressed training flooded back in an instant, and she found herself mentally cataloging weapons, escape routes, defensive positions with the cold precision of someone who'd done this before. "They're jamming communications," she said quietly, the certainty emerging from buried expertise. Standard protocol when you want to control information flow during an operation. Agent Chen was already moving, checking her sidearm with practiced efficiency. "The extraction team I called should have been here by now. Either they've been compromised or replaced entirely." Frank looked between the two women with growing desperation. "Replaced by who?" "By the people who've been waiting 36 years for this moment," Martha said, her voice carrying an authority that made Frank step back involuntarily. She was becoming someone else before his eyes, someone harder, more dangerous, fundamentally different from the woman who'd made him coffee that morning. The first explosion came from the main tunnel entrance, a controlled blast designed to seal rather than destroy. Martha recognized the tactical signature immediately. They weren't trying to kill everyone inside. They were creating a controlled environment where specific targets could be eliminated while preserving evidence. "The safety deposit box," Agent Chen said, understanding the strategy. "They need you alive long enough to extract the location. Then they'll eliminate all witnesses and claim we died in a tragic cave-in." Martha moved to the emergency supplies, her hands finding items she needed without conscious thought. Flares, rope, a small crowbar that could serve as a weapon. The preparations felt natural, muscle memory asserting itself despite 4 decades of dormancy. "There's another way out," she said, the knowledge surfacing like everything else, sudden, certain, terrifying. "I scouted backup routes when we established this place. There's a maintenance shaft that connects to the old mining system." Agent Chen stared at her. "The suppression protocol is completely breaking down. You're remembering operational details that should have been locked away permanently." Frank grabbed Martha's shoulder, forcing her to face him. "Who are you?" "Because the woman I married wouldn't know about backup escape routes and controlled explosions. She couldn't even program the television remote without help." Martha met his eyes and saw her own transformation reflected there. The way she held herself differently now, the coldness that had crept into her expression, the casual competence with which she'd assessed their tactical situation. She was becoming Agent Martha Chen, and Martha Kellerman was disappearing by degrees. "I'm both people," she said, but the words felt hollow. "I'm the woman you loved and the person I was before." "No," Frank said with quiet devastation. "You're choosing which one to be, and you're choosing the one I never knew existed." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She was choosing, selecting memories, mannerisms, responses from her buried identity because they offered survival advantages Martha Kellerman's ordinary life hadn't provided. But each choice took her further from the woman Frank had married. Voices echoed from the sealed tunnel entrance, professional, coordinated, speaking in the tactical shorthand she recognized from her own forgotten career. They were setting up equipment, probably thermal imaging and ground-penetrating radar to map the cavern system before entry. "We have maybe 15 minutes before they find a way in," Agent Chen said. "The maintenance shaft is our only option." Martha looked at the photographs scattered across the floor, evidence of a life she'd lived but could barely remember, proof of capabilities that had made her dangerous enough to hunt for 4 decades. Then she looked at Frank, whose expression held loss as profound as grief. "The evidence in the safety deposit box," she said slowly. "It's not just about the money laundering investigation. There's something else, something that makes me worth killing after all these years." Agent Chen hesitated too long before answering. "Martha, we need to focus on getting out alive." "What else?" Martha's voice carried command authority that made Agent Chen straighten involuntarily. "I can feel it, Sarah. There's something you haven't told me. Something about why the suppression protocol was really necessary." Frank was backing away from both of them now, his face pale with understanding that came before the words. She didn't just investigate the money laundering. She was part of it. The silence that followed confirmed what Martha was already remembering. Fragments of another truth, darker and more complex than the narrative Agent Chen had constructed. She hadn't just gathered evidence during those 3 years undercover. She'd participated, facilitated, made choices that crossed lines federal agents weren't supposed to cross. "I wasn't just investigating the operation," Martha said, the full scope of her past finally crystallizing. "I was running it." And with that admission, she understood why someone would spend 36 years hunting her, why the money in the safe felt like payment rather than pension, why the memory suppression had been so thorough it required psychological reconstruction. She hadn't been a hero forced into hiding. She'd been a criminal offered redemption, and the people closing in weren't seeking justice. They were seeking revenge. The admission hung in the cavern's stale air like a death sentence. Frank's face went through a progression of emotions, shock, betrayal, revulsion, before settling into something Martha had never seen from him before, fear. Not fear of their circumstances, but fear of her. "How much money?" Frank asked quietly. "How much did you steal before they offered you this deal?" Martha closed her eyes, letting the suppressed memories surface fully for the first time. Numbers cascaded through her consciousness, account transfers, laundered payments, Federal Reserve diversions that had funded everything from assassination contracts to judicial bribes. Her photographic memory, the trait that had made her so valuable as a bank manager, had made her indispensable as a criminal facilitator. $237 million, she said, the precision automatic. Over 18 months. "But Frank, I was working for the FBI. They needed someone inside who could—" "Stop." Frank's voice cut through her explanation with surgical precision. "Just stop lying to me, to yourself. If you were undercover, you wouldn't have needed memory suppression. You'd have been debriefed and reassigned." Agent Chen stepped between them, her weapon drawn but lowered. The situation was more complex than standard undercover protocol could handle. Martha had to become convincing enough to fool people who'd spent decades perfecting criminal operations. That required crossing lines that required becoming what you were pretending to be, Frank finished. He looked at Martha with something approaching pity. "You didn't just investigate the corruption. You became corrupted. And when it was over, you liked who you'd become too much to give it up." The words hit Martha with devastating accuracy because they aligned with fragments she was still remembering. The rush of moving massive sums of money with impunity, the intoxication of wielding real power after years of managing other people's modest savings, the moment when she'd realized she could disappear into the identity she'd constructed and leave Martha Kellerman's limitations behind forever. "The Henderson family," she said, understanding flooding through her. "I didn't fail to save them. I was supposed to eliminate them myself." Agent Chen's sharp intake confirmed what Martha already knew was true. The money laundering operation hadn't just involved corrupt officials, it had required permanent silencing of witnesses who could expose the network. Martha hadn't been a federal agent trying to save innocent families. She'd been a criminal operative whose job was ensuring they never testified. "But you couldn't do it," Agent Chen said. "When you got to Phoenix and saw Sarah Henderson with her children, something broke inside you. You called in the tactical team instead of completing the elimination order." Frank backed against the cavern wall, as if the stone could protect him from what his wife was becoming. "You were sent to murder a mother and her children." "Jesus Christ, Martha, who are you?" The question pierced through Martha's returning memories with devastating clarity. She was a woman who'd spent 3 years facilitating murder, theft, and corruption with the methodical efficiency that had once made her the best bank manager in Denver. She was also a woman who'd sacrificed everything to save strangers' children from the machine she'd helped construct. But most terrifyingly, she was discovering that both versions felt equally authentic. "I chose to save them," she said, meeting Frank's horrified gaze. "When it mattered most, I chose to be the person you fell in love with instead of the person I'd become." "After 3 years of being someone else," Frank replied. "After stealing hundreds of millions of dollars and helping murderers escape justice. After becoming everything we spent our whole lives standing against." The sound of drilling came from the sealed tunnel entrance. They were cutting through the blast debris with industrial equipment. Martha estimated they had 5 minutes before the tactical team broke through. Agent Chen moved toward the maintenance shaft, her urgency obvious. "We need to move now. Whatever Martha was before, the people coming for us are worse. They've spent 4 decades perfecting the corruption she helped expose." But Martha found herself unable to move, paralyzed by the weight of recovered memories and Frank's devastated expression. She was remembering not just the crimes she'd committed, but the person she'd been while committing them. Someone who'd enjoyed the power, the complexity, the sophisticated dance of deception that had made every day feel like a chess match played for ultimate stakes. That person was still inside her, awakening after 36 years of dormancy, and that person knew exactly how to get them out of this cavern alive, but the cost would be becoming someone Frank could never forgive. "I can save us," she said quietly, "but you won't recognize me afterward." Frank met her eyes with the resignation of a man who'd already lost everything that mattered. "I don't recognize you now." Outside, the drilling stopped. They were out of time, and Martha faced the choice she'd been avoiding since the memories started returning. Embrace the criminal she'd been, or die as the ordinary woman she'd pretended to become. She reached for Agent Chen's backup weapon and felt 36 years of careful rehabilitation crumble away. The weight of the pistol in Martha's hand felt like coming home to a place she'd forgotten existed. Her grip adjusted automatically to accommodate the weapon's balance, muscle memory asserting itself with terrifying precision. Frank watched her transformation with the helpless horror of someone witnessing a resurrection he'd never wanted to see. "The maintenance shaft leads to a junction point 300 yards northeast," Martha said, her voice carrying an authority that made Agent Chen straighten despite herself. "From there, we can access the old copper mine's secondary ventilation system, but we'll need to move through their perimeter undetected." "How do you know their perimeter positioning?" Agent Chen asked. Martha was already moving toward the shaft, her body language shifting into something predatory and efficient. "Because I trained half the people outside. Before the memory suppression, I spent 6 months developing tactical protocols for witness elimination in underground environments. They're using my own procedures against me." Frank grabbed her arm as she passed, his touch desperate and pleading. "Martha, whatever you're becoming, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." She turned to face him, and Frank saw something in her eyes that made him release his grip involuntarily. "The woman you married was constructed as much as discovered, Frank, built from the pieces of who I was that could survive in ordinary life. But ordinary people don't survive what's waiting outside. The drilling resumed, closer now and accompanied by voices speaking in tactical shorthand. Martha recognized the cadences, the terminology, the methodical approach that meant they had, perhaps, 3 minutes before the breach. Agent Chen was checking her remaining ammunition when Martha's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. The text made her blood turn to ice. The Kellerman woman has outlived her usefulness. Terminate all witnesses and recover the evidence. Leave no forensic trail. They're not planning to interrogate me for the safety deposit box location, Martha said, showing the message to Agent Chen. Someone else already knows where it is. Frank's face went pale. What does that mean? It means the money was never the real target, Martha replied, pieces falling into place with the methodical precision her photographic memory brought to complex patterns. The evidence I gathered isn't just about money laundering. It's about something current, something that's still worth killing for after 36 years. Agent Chen was staring at the message with growing horror. Martha, who else knew about the safety deposit box? But Martha was already accessing deeper memories, ones that had been buried beneath even the operational details. She remembered a conversation in a federal building's basement, words spoken by someone she'd trusted completely, someone who'd helped design her new identity, who'd monitored her psychological recovery, who'd ensured her memory suppression remained intact for 4 decades. You, she said, turning to Agent Chen with the cold realization of ultimate betrayal. You've always known where the evidence was hidden. You're not here to protect me. Agent Chen's hand moved toward her weapon, but Martha was already inside her reach, the tactical training of her former life flowing through her like water finding its natural course. The disarming technique was brutal, efficient, designed to incapacitate without killing because sometimes information was more valuable than corpses. Frank pressed himself against the cavern wall, watching his wife move with the lethal grace of someone who'd spent years perfecting violence as a professional skill. This wasn't the careful, methodical woman who organized their monthly budget and never left dishes in the sink. This was a predator who'd been sleeping for 36 years. The Henderson family, Martha said, securing Agent Chen's weapon while maintaining pressure on her throat. You didn't send a tactical team to save them. You sent one to ensure I completed the elimination order. When I refused, you had them killed anyway and made sure I witnessed the aftermath. Agent Chen's struggles were weakening, but her eyes held defiance rather than fear. The operation required completion. You were becoming liability. Because I was remembering who I used to be before I became what you needed, Martha finished. The bank manager who would never steal, never kill, never betray the trust people placed in federal institutions. The person Frank fell in love with wasn't constructed from my damaged psychology. She was who I'd been before you recruited me. The drilling stopped abruptly, replaced by the distinctive sound of tactical teams preparing for dynamic entry. Martha calculated angles, timing, defensive positions with the cold efficiency that had once made her invaluable to both sides of a criminal conspiracy. She looked at Frank one final time, seeing in his expression the complete loss of everything their marriage had represented. The evidence in the safety deposit box proves that witness protection was used to hide federal agents who'd become criminals, not protect criminals who'd become informants. I was never the only one. Frank's voice was barely a whisper. How many others? Hundreds, Martha replied as the first charges detonated above them. And they're all still out there, living ordinary lives, while their old evidence waits to destroy careers that reach into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. The final confrontation wasn't just coming. It had been inevitable since the moment she'd opened that safe and remembered who she really was. The cavern shook as the second set of charges detonated, sending dust and debris cascading from the ceiling. Martha's tactical mind processed the sound patterns. They were using shaped charges in sequence, professional work designed to preserve structural integrity while creating access points. She had perhaps 90 seconds before they breached the main chamber. "Frank, get to the maintenance shaft," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. But when she turned, she found him frozen against the cavern wall, staring at her with something approaching terror. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't follow someone I don't know." The words hit Martha with devastating precision, but she couldn't afford emotional processing now. Everything she'd learned, every fragment of recovered memory, every skill that had been buried for 36 years, it all crystallized into this moment. She was Agent Martha Chen again, fully and completely, and Agent Chen had never failed a mission because she'd been paralyzed by love. "Then you'll die as Frank Kellerman instead of living as someone you don't recognize," she said with brutal efficiency. "Choose now." Agent Sarah Chen stirred against the rock where Martha had left her, blood trickling from her nose but her eyes alert and calculating. "You can't escape this, Martha. The network reaches too deep. Even if you survive tonight, there's nowhere you can hide that we won't find you." Martha zip-tied Chen's wrists with practiced efficiency, using supplies from the tactical vest. "I'm not planning to hide anymore. I'm planning to finish what I started 36 years ago." The maintenance shaft was a narrow opening barely wide enough for a person, its entrance hidden behind equipment she'd positioned with deliberate care, but accessing it required crossing 20 feet of open space, 20 feet where tactical teams with thermal imaging would have perfect sight lines. Frank hadn't moved from his position against the wall. His face held the resignation of a man who'd already died inside, watching the woman he'd loved transform into someone who calculated human lives like mathematical equations. "The safety deposit box contains more than evidence," Martha continued, checking her weapons with muscle memory that felt like breathing. "It contains instructions for dismantling the entire witness protection corruption network. Names, locations, operational details for sleeper agents positioned throughout federal law enforcement." "How many people will die if you release that information?" Frank asked quietly. Martha paused, the question cutting through her tactical focus like a blade. She was remembering not just her operational capabilities, but the moral complexities that had originally driven her to gather the evidence. People who'd committed crimes, but were now living ordinary lives. Families who had no idea their spouses were former federal operatives. Children who would lose everything if their parents' true identities were exposed. Hundreds of innocents, she admitted, but thousands more will die if the network continues operating. The sound of boot steps echoed through the tunnel. They'd broken through the blast debris and were advancing in formation. Martha recognized the cadence, 2 teams, one advancing while the other provided overwatch, exactly the protocol she'd helped develop. Agent Chen managed to sit up despite her restraints. "You trained them too well, Martha. They know how you think, how you move, what choices you'll make under pressure. You can't outfight your own tactical doctrine." But Martha was smiling now, and the expression was nothing Frank had ever seen on his wife's face. Cold, predatory, anticipating violence like a chess player seeing checkmate 15 moves ahead. "I trained them to fight Agent Martha Chen," she said, moving toward the shaft with fluid precision, "but I didn't train them to fight Martha Kellerman." Frank understood before the words fully registered. She wasn't planning to use her recovered tactical skills to escape. She was planning to use the woman she'd become, the careful, methodical bank manager who'd spent 4 decades perfecting patience, observation, and the ability to spot patterns others missed. "The blizzard," she continued, her voice now carrying both identities simultaneously. "It's not just providing cover for their operation, it's providing cover for mine. Because Martha Kellerman knows this mountain better than any federal tactical team, she spent every summer for 20 years hiking these trails with her husband." The first tactical light appeared in the tunnel opening, sweeping the cavern with professional precision. Martha was already moving, but not toward the maintenance shaft. Instead, she was positioning herself behind equipment that would funnel their approach into a kill zone designed by someone who understood both their training and the mountain's geography. "You're going to fight them?" Frank asked, disbelief overwhelming his fear. No, Martha replied, checking her sight lines with the cold efficiency of someone who'd spent years perfecting murder. I'm going to teach them the difference between a criminal who became an ordinary person and an ordinary person who remembers how to be a criminal. The final test wasn't about choosing between her identities anymore. It was about using both of them to survive what she'd created. The first tactical officer breached the cavern entrance with textbook precision, weapon raised, scanning for threats. Martha let him advance 3 steps before triggering the equipment cascade she'd calculated with bank manager methodical precision and positioned with assassin lethality. The mining equipment toppled in sequence, creating chaos where there should have been controlled advance. But Martha wasn't watching the falling machinery. She was studying the team's reaction patterns, cataloging their training responses with the photographic memory that had made her valuable to both sides of a deadly conspiracy. "Alpha Team, we have obstruction in the primary advance," came the radio chatter. "Switching to flanking Protocol 7. Protocol 7. Martha had written that procedure herself, designed for underground environments where traditional tactical advantages were neutralized. They would split into 2 elements, one creating distraction while the other advanced through alternative routes. What they didn't know was that Martha Kellerman had spent every summer for 20 years exploring every inch of these abandoned mine systems with her husband. She moved through shadows with the patience she'd learned, balancing monthly budgets, and the lethal silence she'd mastered, killing witnesses. Behind her, Frank remained frozen against the cavern wall, watching his wife flow between equipment like smoke, every movement precise and deadly. Team 2 advanced through the eastern shaft. The radio crackled. "Subject is contained in primary chamber." Martha smiled with predatory satisfaction. They were using her own protocols, which meant they were predictable. She'd designed those procedures to be efficient, not adaptive, because federal tactical teams needed consistency more than creativity. But criminals needed to survive by any means necessary. She reached the concealed position she'd selected, a blind spot where her knowledge of mining operations intersected with her understanding of tactical doctrine. From here, she could force them into choices that favored methodical observation over immediate violence. The second team appeared at the eastern entrance, moving with professional caution. Martha counted 4 operators, night vision active, communications coordinated. Everything exactly as she'd trained them, which meant everything exactly as she could predict. Agent Chen's voice echoed through the cavern, strained but defiant. "Martha's in the western sector, near the shaft entrance. She's armed and demonstrating tactical proficiency consistent with her original training." The betrayal cut deep, but Martha felt only cold calculation. Chen was providing intelligence to guide the assault, which meant Martha needed to become someone they hadn't trained to fight. Not Agent Martha Chen, who thought like a federal operative, not Martha Kellerman, who thought like a bank manager, but someone who combined both skill sets into something entirely new. "Frank," she called softly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades managing complex systems under pressure. "The maintenance shaft leads northeast for 300 yards before branching. Take the left branch. It connects to the original mine entrance 2 miles down the mountain." "I'm not leaving you," Frank replied, though his voice carried more resignation than determination. "Yes, you are." Martha was already moving toward the advancing teams, but her approach wasn't tactical assault. It was methodical manipulation of environmental factors. "Because one of us needs to survive to release the evidence in that safety deposit box. And I'm the only one who remembers how to kill professionally." The first engagement happened faster than Frank could track. One moment the tactical officer was advancing through calculated cover, the next he was down, his weapon clattering across stone. Martha hadn't shot him. She'd used the mine's geography to create a trap that neutralized him without alerting his team. "Alpha Team, lost contact with Point Man," came the radio chatter, tension creeping into professional calm. Martha was already repositioning, using knowledge of mining operations to stay ahead of their search patterns. She understood their protocols because she'd written them, but they didn't understand her because the woman she'd become was someone who'd never existed during their training. She was a bank manager with an assassin's reflexes, an ordinary person who remembered extraordinary lethality, a criminal who'd learned to think like a law-abiding citizen, then applied that perspective to survival. The second engagement was even quicker. Martha used their own communication procedures against them, creating confusion about position and movement while she eliminated another operator through environmental manipulation rather than direct violence. But she could hear more teams approaching through the tunnel system, backup units with heavier equipment and authorization for lethal force. Her tactical advantage was temporary, dependent on fighting small numbers in controlled space. "Martha." Agent Chen's voice was weaker now, but still calculating. "You can't fight the entire federal task force. Surrender now and we can negotiate terms." "I'm not fighting a task force," Martha replied, moving toward the maintenance shaft where Frank waited with terrified confusion. "I'm fighting the corruption that turned federal agents into criminals and criminals into federal agents." Behind them, tactical lights swept the cavern with increasing coordination. The final confrontation was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control, and Martha faced the choice that would define everything: save Frank and flee, or stay and eliminate the witnesses who could destroy hundreds of innocent families built on buried identities. The woman she'd been would have chosen duty. The woman she'd become would have chosen love. But the woman she was becoming would find a third option that protected both. Martha's choice crystallized with the brutal clarity of a bank vault's tumblers falling into place. She could hear Frank breathing heavily behind her, the tactical teams coordinating their final assault, and Agent Chen's labored attempts to provide intelligence despite her injuries. But beneath all that noise was the sound of her own heartbeat, steady, methodical, accepting. "The safety deposit box key," she said, turning to Frank with an expression that carried both love and finality. "It's taped under the dashboard of the truck, driver's side. Box 1247 at Mountain Federal Credit Union in Evergreen." Frank's eyes widened with understanding. "Martha, no. The evidence inside will destroy the network," she continued, checking her remaining ammunition with practiced efficiency. "But it will also destroy us. Every witness protection identity, every family built on buried truth, every person who chose ordinary life over criminal survival, including us." The advancing tactical lights were coordinating now. 3 teams moving in synchronized patterns that would eliminate her environmental advantages within minutes. Martha calculated angles, ammunition counts, escape routes with the cold precision that had once made her invaluable. But the mathematics were unforgiving. She might neutralize one more team, possibly 2, but eventually they would overwhelm her position. "I can't release that evidence," Frank whispered. "It would destroy hundreds of innocent people." "And I can't let this network continue operating," Martha replied. "They've been using witness protection to hide criminals in federal positions for 4 decades. The Hendersons were just the beginning. There will be more families eliminated, more witnesses silenced, more ordinary people caught between competing versions of justice." Agent Chen struggled to sit upright, blood still trickling from her nose. "You're both missing the point," she gasped. "The evidence doesn't matter anymore. You've already compromised the network by remembering your original identity. They'll dismantle everything and rebuild somewhere else, with new protocols you've never seen." Martha felt the words hit like a physical blow. 36 years of careful construction, not just her identity, but the entire witness protection corruption system, was being abandoned because she'd recovered memories that made her too dangerous to contain. Everyone in the network, all the ordinary families living quiet lives built on buried truth, would lose everything anyway. "How long do they have?" she asked. 72 hours, Chen admitted. Emergency extraction protocols for compromised deep cover operations. By Christmas morning, everyone with connections to the original witness protection corruption will have new identities or be eliminated as security risks. The tactical teams were in position now. Martha could see their lights creating overlapping fields of fire, professional coordination that left no escape routes. She'd trained them too well. They were using her own procedures to eliminate her. Frank was staring at the maintenance shaft with desperate longing. We could still run, find somewhere they'll never look, start over again. No, Martha said with quiet finality. I'm 68 years old, Frank. I've been starting over my entire adult life. I'm tired of running from who I used to be. She moved toward the shaft, but not to escape. Instead, she began placing charges from the tactical vest with methodical precision, calculating structural weak points with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to balancing complex financial accounts. The explosives weren't meant to kill pursuing officers. They were meant to collapse the entire tunnel system. Martha, what are you doing? Buying you time, she replied, setting timers with steady hands. The evidence in that safety deposit box is worthless now, but you can still warn the families. 72 hours to disappear before the network abandons them. Frank understood with devastating clarity. She wasn't planning to die fighting federal agents. She was planning to sacrifice herself to give innocent people a chance to survive the network's abandonment. The woman who'd spent 4 decades protecting their quiet life was choosing to destroy it in order to protect others. I won't leave you, he said, though his voice carried the resignation of someone who'd already accepted the inevitable. Yes, you will, Martha replied, completing the explosive sequence. Because this is what love looks like when the person you love remembers how to be a killer. The tactical teams were advancing through all entrances simultaneously. Martha had perhaps 30 seconds before they breached the main chamber. She looked at Frank one final time, seeing in his expression the complete understanding of what her choice meant. Tell them I died as Martha Kellerman, she said softly. The woman who organized monthly budgets and never left dishes in the sink, not the other one. Frank disappeared into the maintenance shaft just as the first tactical officer rounded the equipment barrier. Martha detonated the charges with the calm precision of someone balancing a complex equation, collapsing tons of mountain stone between her husband's escape and the advancing teams. The cost of victory was everything she'd become. The price of saving innocence was sacrificing the ordinary woman Frank had loved. But Agent Martha Chen died, ensuring that Martha Kellerman's final act was protecting people who would never know her name. The mine shaft collapsed with the finality of a bank vault sealing shut, tons of Colorado granite falling in mathematical precision that would have impressed the bank manager Martha had died protecting. In the absolute darkness that followed, Frank crawled through maintenance tunnels with his wife's sacrifice echoing behind him. Not the sound of the explosion, but her final words about love and remembering how to kill. 3 hours later, he emerged into the blizzard 2 miles down the mountain, hypothermic and broken, carrying nothing but truck keys and the weight of understanding that Martha Kellerman had never truly existed. She'd been a carefully constructed identity protecting Agent Martha Chen, who had died protecting families she'd never met from a corruption network that was already abandoning them. The truck started on the second try. Frank's hands shook as he reached under the dashboard, finding the safety deposit box key exactly where Martha had said it would be. Such methodical precision, even in her final moments. He sat in the cab as snow accumulated on the windshield, staring at a small metal key that represented the end of every ordinary life built on buried truth. By dawn, the Mountain Federal Credit Union parking lot was empty, except for Frank's truck and 2 other vehicles whose occupants were probably facing similar reckonings. Box 1247 contained exactly what Martha had promised: comprehensive evidence of witness protection corruption, detailed records of criminal to federal agent identity swaps, and a list of 342 families who had 72 hours to disappear before becoming security risks. Frank recognized some of the names. The Hendersons had just been the beginning. There were grocery store managers who'd once been contract killers, suburban soccer moms who'd testified against organized crime families, retired teachers whose previous identities had died in federal custody, all of them ordinary people now, living quiet lives that were about to be destroyed. He drove through Colorado's mountain communities for 2 days, knocking on doors during the worst blizzard in state history. Most of the conversations were surreal, telling a Little League coach that his real name was something else entirely, explaining to a grandmother that her grandchildren would never be safe if she didn't disappear immediately. Some families listened. Others slammed doors on what sounded like an elaborate scam. Frank didn't blame them. If someone had appeared at his door 3 days ago claiming that Martha was a former federal assassin, he would have called the police. But a surprising number believed him, perhaps recognizing something in his devastated expression that validated impossible truth. By Christmas Eve, he'd warned 127 families. He had no idea how many would actually run, but he'd kept Martha's final promise to give innocent people a chance. The FBI found him Christmas morning, sitting in the Mountain View diner where he and Martha had eaten breakfast 4 days earlier, when their biggest concern was eviction notices and utility bills. Agent Chen's replacement was a younger woman with sympathetic eyes and the careful speech patterns of someone delivering rehearsed condolences. "Mr. Kellerman, I'm Agent Sarah Morrison. I'm very sorry for your loss." Frank looked up from coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "Which loss?" "My wife, Martha Kellerman, who organized community fundraisers and never left dishes in the sink? Or Agent Martha Chen, who remembered how to kill professionally and chose to die protecting people she'd never met?" Agent Morrison sat across from him with the cautious respect of someone approaching dangerous evidence. "The mine collapse killed 2 federal agents and Agent Chen. There were no other casualties recorded." "Good," Frank said quietly. "She would have wanted to be remembered as the woman who died saving people, not the agent who remembered how to murder them." "The Witness Protection Corruption Network you've been warning families about," Morrison continued. "We've arrested 12 federal agents in 3 states. The safety deposit box evidence was comprehensive enough to dismantle operations that had been running since the 1980s. Frank nodded without satisfaction. Justice felt abstract when weighed against Martha's sacrifice. "How many families got away?" "We don't know, but several of the names on your list have completely disappeared, along with their children. Clean exits, no traces. Someone taught them proper disappearing procedures." Martha's final gift to people who would never know her name. Frank almost smiled, remembering how she'd always been better at protecting others than protecting herself. "What happens to me now?" he asked. Agent Morrison's expression carried genuine uncertainty. "Technically, you were never under witness protection. Frank Kellerman was always your real identity. You're free to go." "Free to go." Frank considered the phrase while staring through the diner window at snow-covered mountains that would always remind him of the moment love looked like watching someone remember how to be a killer. He was 69 years old, broke, homeless, and carrying the weight of understanding that his entire marriage had been built on necessary lies told by an extraordinary woman pretending to be ordinary. But he was alive because Martha had chosen to die as the person she'd become rather than the person she'd been. Frank stood outside the Mountain View diner as Agent Morrison's car disappeared into the grey December morning, her words echoing with hollow finality. Free to go. But freedom felt like another word for emptiness when everything that had defined his world was buried under tons of Colorado granite. He walked the 3 blocks to downtown Evergreen, muscle memory guiding him past storefronts decorated with Christmas lights that seemed obscene in their cheerfulness. The hardware store where he'd bought weather stripping, the grocery where Martha had insisted on clipping coupons even when they weren't broke, the library where she'd volunteered every Thursday, helping elderly patrons navigate computer systems with the patient precision that had once managed federal financial operations. None of these people knew they'd lost someone extraordinary. To them, Martha Kellerman had simply been the quiet woman who organized coat drives and remembered everyone's grandchildren's names. They would never understand that she'd died protecting families she'd never met from a corruption network that had turned witness protection into criminal enterprise. But Frank understood something else now. That version of Martha hadn't been pretense. The woman who left casseroles for sick neighbors and balanced their monthly budget down to the penny had been real, built carefully over 36 years of choosing ordinary kindness over extraordinary violence. Agent Chen had remembered how to kill, but Martha Kellerman had learned how to live. The difference mattered. He found himself standing outside the small apartment building where they'd been evicted 4 days ago, though it felt like decades. The landlord's notice was still taped to their former door, Christmas Eve eviction proceeding as scheduled despite the tenants being dead or missing. Frank almost laughed at the bureaucratic absurdity. Martha would have found some methodical way to resolve even this final administrative detail. Mrs. Patterson from apartment 2B emerged with her garbage, recognizing him with the startled sympathy of someone confronting unexpected tragedy. "Frank? Oh my God, I heard about the accident. I'm so sorry about Martha." Accident. That's what they were calling it. Mine collapsed during the blizzard. Tragic casualties. Case closed. No mention of federal corruption or witness protection or the woman who died choosing love over survival. "Thank you, Eleanor," he managed. "She would have appreciated that." Mrs. Patterson hesitated, then pulled an envelope from her coat pocket. "This came for you yesterday. I signed for it. Thought you might need it when you got back." The return address made Frank's chest tighten. Denver Federal Savings and Loan, Employee Benefits Division. Martha's former employer, the bank where she'd worked for 15 years before her termination following the 1987 robbery. The job she'd lost when security protocols she'd accidentally exposed led to the largest Federal Reserve theft in Colorado history. Except now Frank knew she hadn't accidentally exposed anything. She'd been Agent Chen conducting authorized intelligence gathering that had been deliberately misrepresented to create her cover identity. Her termination had been federal theater, her disgrace carefully manufactured. Inside the envelope was a benefit statement and a letter dated 3 days ago. "Dear Mrs. Kellerman, our records indicate discrepancies in your 1987 termination file. Recent federal audit procedures have revealed that your dismissal was based on falsified evidence. The bank's board of directors has voted to posthumously reinstate your employment record and authorize full pension benefits retroactive to your termination date. Enclosed, please find a benefits check in the amount of $127,847.23, representing 35 years of pension payments plus accumulated interest." Frank stared at the check with something between laughter and devastation. Even in death, Martha was still managing complex financial systems, still ensuring their practical needs were met through careful long-term planning. Somehow she'd arranged for her cover identity's rehabilitation, probably through evidence planted in the safety deposit box. But the money wasn't what broke him. It was the accompanying employee photo from 1987, Martha at 32, wearing the serious expression of someone managing million-dollar transactions. Her hair styled differently, but her eyes carrying the same methodical intelligence he'd fallen in love with. The woman in the photograph was simultaneously Agent Chen and Martha Kellerman, both identities equally real. "Frank, are you all right?" Mrs. Patterson was watching him with growing concern. Frank realized he was crying, standing on a snowy sidewalk holding evidence of the extraordinary woman who'd chosen to love him with an ordinary life built on extraordinary sacrifice. "I'm fine," he said, folding the letter carefully. Just remembering someone who was better at protecting others than protecting herself. He walked back toward his truck, past the diner where they'd shared their last breakfast, past the mountains where Martha had died, saving people who would never know her name. Frank Kellerman was 69 years old, alone, and carrying the weight of understanding that true love sometimes meant watching someone remember how to be a killer. But he was also carrying Martha's final gift, enough money to disappear properly, to find somewhere safe and build something new. Not ordinary, because ordinary had died in a collapsed mineshaft, but something worthy of the woman who'd spent 36 years proving that extraordinary people could choose quiet lives without losing their capacity for extraordinary love. Frank drove south, toward whatever came after the end of everything, carrying Martha's legacy in a pension check and the knowledge that some promises were worth dying to keep. Frank drove for 3 days through New Mexico's high desert, following highways that stretched toward horizons Martha would never see. The pension check sat folded in his wallet like a talisman, not for the money but for what it represented. Even orchestrating her own death, she'd been planning for his future with the same methodical care she'd once applied to their monthly budgets. On the 4th day, he found it. A small town called Socorro, population 8,000, where desert wind carved stories into red stone and no one asked complicated questions about where you'd come from. The rental house was modest, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with windows facing west toward mountains that looked nothing like Colorado's granite peaks. Frank unpacked slowly, clothes Martha had folded, books she'd organized alphabetically, the coffee maker they'd bought together 15 years ago when their biggest decision was French roast versus medium blend. Each item was an archaeology of ordinary life, built by an extraordinary woman who'd chosen to love a retired mechanic with complete honesty about everything except who she'd been before she became his wife. The local garage was hiring. Frank's hands still remembered transmissions and brake systems, skills that translated across decades and identities. The owner, a weathered man named Pete, asked no questions beyond whether Frank could handle a wrench and show up on time. Martha would have appreciated the simplicity. Evenings, Frank walked Socorro's quiet streets and found himself building new routines. Coffee at sunrise, work until 4, dinner at the small Mexican restaurant where the waitress called him mijo and brought extra salsa without asking. Television news that he watched differently now, recognizing the careful omissions and sanitized explanations that protected operational security. The FBI had classified Martha's story, but fragments leaked through. A federal corruption investigation, arrests in 3 states, witness protection reforms that would prevent criminal-to-agent identity swaps. Martha's sacrifice had dismantled a system that had operated since the 1980s, saving families who would never know her name. Frank started volunteering at the local community center, teaching basic auto maintenance to anyone interested. Martha had always said that useful skills were gifts worth sharing. He found unexpected satisfaction in showing a young mother how to change her oil, watching elderly men discover they could still learn new things. It wasn't the same as Martha's community organizing, but it carried forward her belief that ordinary kindness mattered. 6 months after the mine collapse, Frank received a postcard with no return address, just a photograph of Seattle's waterfront and 2 words on the back, "Thank you." He recognized the careful handwriting. Mrs. Henderson, the grocery store manager who'd been one of the first families he'd warned. She'd listened, disappeared with her grandchildren, found somewhere safe to rebuild. Martha's final mission had worked. More postcards arrived sporadically. A lighthouse in Maine, Disney World, the Grand Canyon. Always the same message, "Thank you." Never signatures, never explanations, just proof that families were alive, safe, starting over with the time Martha had bought them. Frank kept the postcards in a shoebox, evidence of promises kept by someone who died choosing love over survival. Winter came to Socorro with gentle insistence, nothing like Colorado's brutal blizzards. Frank decorated his small house with simple lights, remembering how Martha had always insisted that Christmas meant hope, even in dark times, especially in dark times. On Christmas morning, exactly 1 year after her death, Frank made coffee using her favorite mug and sat watching sunrise paint the desert gold. He wasn't the same man who'd been evicted from that Denver apartment. That Frank had been ordinary, unremarkable, living a quiet life without understanding its extraordinary foundation. This Frank knew things about love that looked like watching someone remember how to kill, about sacrifice that protected strangers, about the difference between being ordinary and choosing ordinary after understanding what extraordinary cost. He pulled out writing paper, actual paper, like Martha had always preferred for important things, and began composing a letter to the FBI. Not confessions or complaints, just a simple request. He wanted Martha Kellerman's name added to the federal memorial for agents killed in the line of duty. Not Agent Chen's name. That identity belonged to operational history. But Martha Kellerman deserved recognition for choosing to die protecting others. The letter took him 3 drafts to get right. Martha would have approved of the careful precision, the respectful tone, the logical presentation of facts. He signed it Frank Kellerman, widower, and drove to the post office through Socorro's peaceful streets. Walking back toward his truck, Frank felt something settle in his chest. Not closure. Martha's absence would always be a weight he carried, but acceptance, understanding that love sometimes meant learning to live with impossible knowledge, and that ordinary life could honor extraordinary sacrifice. He drove home past the garage where he'd rebuilt transmissions, past the community center where he'd taught useful skills, past the restaurant where the waitress had started saving his usual table. Frank Kellerman was 70 years old, alone, and building something new. Something worthy of the woman who'd spent 36 years proving that extraordinary people could choose quiet love without losing their capacity for extraordinary courage. Something that looked exactly like home,